Alien soldier recalls the bone-chilling stories from human warfare. My hands are shaking. I need you to understand what that means. I am Skethel, commander of the 9th Carapace Legion, 41 years of service, 4 sectors pacified under my direct command, 11,000 kills in official Legion record, a number cited in 16 separate military training programs as a benchmark for sustained operational effectiveness. I have walked through the aftermath of battles that made junior soldiers stop functioning entirely. I have led charges against species that outweighed us in size, firepower, and numbers. I have stood in chambers like this one and delivered bad news with complete steadiness because that is what I was built to do. I am standing in this chamber right now, and I cannot make my hands stop shaking. The council chamber is calibrated for 17 species simultaneously, which means the light is precisely wrong for every single one of us. Somewhere in the back rows, the Qual delegation sit in their mobile water enclosures. The tall Merith flank the upper tiers, the insectoid Creeth cluster near the filtered air vents. I have presented in this chamber 46 times. I know every tier, every delegation, every protocol. I set my data slate down on the plinth, and I will not pick it up again. There is a crack in the plinth, thin, diagonal, running from the upper left corner toward the center, old crack. Someone probably filed a maintenance report about it years ago and then forgot. I have been staring at it since I walked up here, and I cannot stop. Honored council, I say, the sound of my voice is steady, that much I can control. I was summoned here to evaluate the species designated human to determine whether they represent a military threat to the galactic order, whether they hold potential as an allied force, or whether they are a civilization that can be guided into compliance through standard diplomatic or military measures. From the 3rd tier, Qual Elder Veth speaks from inside his water enclosure. He has assessed 47 civilizations from that same chair without ever setting foot on another world. Commander, your recommendation. I will give you 3 stories first. The murmuring is immediate. 17 species, 17 tonal registers of the same sound, which is the sound of expectation being violated. I know this sound. I have never caused it before. A formal council hearing operates on data projections and numbered probability assessments. No one tells stories in this chamber. Council speaker Solon Murath, ancient, tall as a young tree, looks at me the way very old things look at the unexpected. Commander Skethel, this is outside standard procedure. Yes, I say it is. I look at the crack in the plinth. I look back at Solon. For 2 years I have attempted to construct a standard assessment report. For this species, I have written 7 complete drafts. I have deleted every one of them because they were accurate in every measurement and false in the only thing that matters. The data I have will not carry what it needs to carry. So I am asking you to hear 3 stories. After the stories, I will give you my recommendation. Solon is old enough to know when something is not negotiable. He nods. Proceed. I want to tell you what I am before I tell you what I found. This is load-bearing information. I am not giving you my history as a credential. I'm giving it to you so that when I say the word that comes later, you understand the full weight of it. I led my first ground operation at 19. My first sector pacification was complete before I was 30. By 40, the 9th Legion was the training standard. For 6 other legions across 3 sectors, officers senior to me sent their recruits to my commanders because my commanders produce the best soldiers in the known galaxy. I am not given to dramatization. I do not report things I cannot verify. I am a machine designed to observe threat, calculate response, and produce clear recommendations. I cannot produce a clear recommendation about the humans. This has never happened to me before. Now, the thing you need to hold before I begin. The Vreth do not have the neurochemical process you know as fear. I will be precise because precision matters here. We assess threats, calculate survival odds, and execute decisions. What your species call courage, we have never possessed because courage requires fear as its necessary precondition. You cannot choose to be brave unless you first have something to be afraid of. We have no such thing. We evaluate and we act. For 41 years, I believe this made us the superior soldiers in the known galaxy. I am revising that belief. 4 years ago, I was assigned standard first contact and assessment duties in the Outer Spiral Arm, routine mission, threat classification, cultural profile, alliance potential. I had completed the same assignment 17 times before. Standard duration 30 days, preliminary report filed, move on. I spent 19 months. I filed 7 complete assessment reports during those 19 months. I deleted each one, not because the data was wrong. The data was correct in every single entry. I deleted them because when I read the conclusions they produced, something in me recognized that they were missing the most important thing, and I could not identify what the missing thing was. I kept trying. 7 reports, 19 months. I have it now. That is why I am standing here. But before the thing itself, there is a foundation you need. 1 sentence. Everything I am going to tell you is built on this 1 sentence. Humans are afraid. Not sometimes, not under exceptional conditions, always, every one of them. Every day of their lives, their kind evolved as prey animals on a world that was trying to consume them before they learned to fight back. The fear response is hardwired into the oldest and deepest architecture of their brain, a system so ancient and so sensitive that it triggers at shadows in dark corridors, at unexpected sounds in quiet rooms, at futures they construct in their own minds at 3:00 in the morning when no actual threat exists. They have been running from something since the beginning of their existence. The fear never leaves. It is in their bodies before a battle. It is in their hands when they reach for a weapon. It is in their breath when they step toward something terrible. You are going to want to remember that, because now I am going to tell you what those afraid creatures did. I will start with a young man named Owen, who was 22 years old in a year they counted as 1917 on their single inhabited world. I did not find Owen a military record. I found him in a letter he wrote to his mother. The letter is sitting in an archive on his planet 100 years old, and it has been read by millions of his own species. I read it 11 times. I read it the 11th time because I was still trying to understand what it was doing to me and why. He wrote to his mother about the mud. He was careful and specific about the mud because the mud was something that needed careful explanation. He said it was not the kind of mud you imagine when You hear the word, it was deep, it went. On longer than mud should, men stepped into it and did not come back up, and the people who saw it happen had to keep moving. It smelled like iron and something older and worse that Owen said he did not have a word for. He described the color and the weight of it and the way it pulled at your boots, with every step like the ground itself was holding on. He wrote all of this in careful, neat handwriting. Then he wrote this: the sunsets here are worth seeing, mother. Last night the sky went red and orange all the way to the edge of the world, and my friend George said it looked like the world was catching fire from the inside out. We stood there and watched it together. We all agreed it was the most beautiful thing any of us had seen in months. Owen and George in the mud in the 4th year of the war, watching the sky turn red, and Owen put the sunset in an envelope and sent it home to his mother. I have looked at that letter the way I have been looking at this crack in the plinth. Something keeps pulling me back. Something in it will not settle. I do not have a word for what it does to me, but I know it does something, and I know that it should not, and I know that the fact that it does is the beginning of everything I am trying to tell you. The sunset is not the story. The sunset is the light that makes the story visible. The story is what happened in that mud. The story is what Owen and George and Arthur and Henry and Walter and every other soldier on every side of that war did in conditions that should have broken the will of any army within the first 18 months by every measure of military endurance I have ever studied. I am going to tell you that story now. The war they fought from 1914 to 1918 was fought over a stretch of European territory that measured in galactic terms is approximately nothing. In places, the front line that divided the two sides was less than 100 m wide. Both sides dug trenches into the ground and settled into them and refused to move. They held these positions for 4 years. I have commanded ground campaigns on 43 worlds. In 37 of those campaigns I have never held a defensive position I could not withdraw from an under 6 rotation cycles. I do not hold positions I cannot abandon if the tactical calculation demands it. No rational military command structure holds positions it cannot abandon. That is the first principle of sustainable ground warfare. You hold what you can defend. When you cannot defend it, you move. The humans did not move. They stayed in the mud, in the trenches, under fire that did not stop through winters that killed soldiers who had survived the actual fighting in conditions that their own medical officers recorded as incompatible with long-term human health, and they held those positions for 4 years. I ran the loss calculations. In the first year alone, both sides lost numbers that should have triggered withdrawal under every military logic framework available. I'm not going to give you the exact figures because numbers at this scale stop meaning anything and start just being large. What I will tell you is that the numbers should have ended the war. Any species with access to loss statistics and a functioning command structure evaluates the numbers and makes the decision to stop. The math says stop. The human math did not say stop. Their commanders looked at the same numbers I looked at and ordered them to hold. Their soldiers looked at the same mud I read about in Owen's letter, and they stayed in it. And this is the part that took me 6 months of analysis to understand. Most of them were not staying because they were forced to at Gunpoint some were, most were not, most of them were staying because of something else, something I did not have. A category 4. I call it the calculus failure because that is the most accurate technical description I have. The math should have resolved, it did not. The math kept failing to resolve for 4 years, and the human soldiers kept staying in the mud and watching sunsets with their friends and writing letters home and then picking up their weapons in the morning and doing it again. I need to tell you about a soldier named Arthur. Arthur was not in Owen's regiment. He was 34, which in human terms means he was old enough to have had a life before the war that was worth returning to. He had a wife named Clara and 2 daughters whose names I found in his service record. He wrote to Clara every week without missing a single week for 4 years, 4 years, hundreds of letters. I read a portion of them. They are also in the archive. His kind have preserved these letters because his kind understands that these letters contain something that must not be lost. Arthur never told Clara how bad it was. Not once, not in 4 years. He wrote about the weather and about the food when they food was tolerable, and about what they other soldiers said that made him laugh, and about the small things he looked forward to when he came home. He described a particular chair by the fireplace in the house they shared. He mentioned that chair in 11 different letters, just the chair, the way it felt to sit in it after a long day, how he was going to sit in it when he got back and not move for a week. He did not come home. I sat with that information for a long time after I found it. The archive has hundreds of thousands of letters like Arthur's, hundreds of thousands of soldiers writing to the people they loved about chairs by fireplaces they would never sit in again, writing with hope they had no real evidence to justify writing anyway, because the alternative to writing with unjustified hope is not writing at all, and not writing meant something they would not permit. Now I want to tell you about something I found in the records that genuinely stopped my analysis for 3 days. Between the years 1914 and 1918, on the Western Front, during one of the worst military conflicts their civilization had ever experienced, the soldiers on both sides of the line sometimes stopped fighting. They stopped, not because the shooting stopped, not because their commanders ordered them to pause, not because there was a negotiated ceasefire that came down through official channels. They stopped because it was a certain day on their calendar that both sides considered important, and they came out of the trenches and stood in the open ground between the 2 lines, which was the most dangerous ground on that entire front, and they talked to each other. They exchanged small gifts, food mostly. Some of them played a game together in that open ground, then they went back to their trenches, then they went back to the war. I ran that through every military psychology framework I have access to. None of them have a category for it. I sent a query to the Legion's academic research unit asking for any documented parallel in galactic military history. They sent back a single word reply: none. This happened more than once, in different years, in different locations. Along the front, soldiers who were trying to stop each other on either side of that date simply decided, without authorization, without command, without any formal agreement, that on this particular day they would not. They would do something human instead. And then they went back to the war. I told you I would tell you about a photograph. There is an image in the archive, black and white the way they're early. Photography was grainy the way old technology always is. It shows a group of soldiers standing in an open field. They are dirty, you can see it even in the faded image. Their uniforms are crusted with the same mud Owen described to his mother. They are in the middle of the most catastrophic ground conflict their civilization had yet experienced. They are surrounded by evidence of destruction that the camera's edges cannot quite contain. They are laughing. Not one of them, not two in the corner. Pretending for the camera, all of them. The man in the center, who I later identified as a soldier named George, has his head thrown back and his mouth open and his eyes completely shut, which is what their faces do when something is genuinely, uncontrollably funny. The men on either side of him are in similar states. One of them is holding his side, one of them has his hand on George's shoulder. I thought the photograph was damaged the first time I saw it. I thought something in the image processing had introduced an error. The expressions did not match the context. It made no sense for those expressions to be on those faces in that place. I investigated further. The photograph was not damaged. George and his friends were laughing because someone had just said something funny. In the mud, in the fourth year, someone said something funny and George laughed until his eyes closed and his head went back, and someone put a hand on his shoulder and someone else held his side because it hurt to laugh that hard. I have thought about that photograph for 3 years. I think about it more than I think about any battle I have ever fought, and I still cannot tell you with complete confidence what it means, but I will tell you what I think it means, because thinking about it is part of the thing I am carrying into this chamber today. I think it means that in the middle of conditions designed to strip human beings down to nothing, the humans found a way to stay human, not in spite of the conditions inside the conditions. They were afraid every day. They were cold and exhausted and watching the world come apart around them. They wrote home about chairs by fireplaces. They described sunsets from the mud, and in the middle of all of that, someone made a joke and George laughed until it hurt. I think that is the most militarily significant thing I found in 2 years of research. I think I still do not fully understand why. That is the first story. The second one is harder. Every warrior species in the known galaxy shapes its own narrative about war. This is not unique to humans. The Vreth honor fallen soldiers by incorporating their carapace into the armor of those who survived, which is both a ritual and an act of continuity. The Qual build towers of compressed bone that record their wars in three-dimensional architecture. The Merith compose long oral histories that assign meaning to every engagement. Every species that fights also tells stories about fighting, and every species shapes those stories to produce more soldiers willing to fight again. I understood this when I began studying human war culture. I recognized the pattern immediately. Then I found the rest of it. Humans in the same years they were producing material designed to convince their young to enter conflict were also producing art that described the conflict as a catastrophe, not one or the other, both simultaneously. In the same culture, in the same years, sometimes in the same publications. I need to explain what I mean because The council will not have a framework. For this, there was a soldier named Wilfred who fought in the same war as Owen. He was a poet. Humans have always produced poets, which is a specific kind of person who uses language with the deliberate intention of saying true things in ways that cannot be dismissed. Wilfred wrote poems about the war while he was inside it. He sent them to people back home. Some of those poems were published. People read them. Those poems described the war as a lie. I do not mean he expressed dissatisfaction. I mean he wrote informal literary language that his culture respected, that everything the recruitment material had said about the war was false, and that the reality of the war was terrible, ways that language could barely hold, and that any person who told a young soldier going to this war was right and noble was telling them something that was not true. He said this clearly in public while the war was still happening. His culture did not silence him. His culture preserved those poems. 100 years later, his people consider those poems among the most important things their civilization has ever produced. They are taught in schools to children. They are quoted in speeches. They are the poems people reach for when they need to say something true about the cost of war. Wilfred did not survive the war. He was killed 7 days before it ended. I sat with that fact for a long time. But here is what matters for the council's purposes, and here is what stopped my analysis for 3 full days. When I found it, the poems were read, the truth in them was heard. The people of that civilization knew what the war actually was, what it actually cost, what it actually meant. They had Wilfred's words, they had Owen's letters, they had the photographs, they had the testimony of every soldier who came home and told the truth about what they had seen. The information was available, the reality was documented and preserved and shared. And they kept going to the wars, not because they did not know, because they knew, and they went anyway. I want to be precise about this because I do not want the council to misunderstand. I'm not describing a civilization that deceived its soldiers into service. Some of that happened. There was pressure and there was social enforcement that causes individuals to make choices they would not otherwise make. That exists in every species. That is not what I am describing. I am describing the soldiers who had read Wilfred's poems, who knew exactly what the reality was, who had held the information in their hands, understood it, and then reported to the recruitment office. In the morning, there was a young man named Frank who enlisted in a later conflict 40 years after Owen's War. In a year they counted as 1942. I found his personal diary in the archive. He was not a poet. He was 20 years old, and he worked in his family's bakery before he enlisted. In the diary entry written the night before he reported for duty, he wrote this: I have read about what war is. I know it is not the way they show it in the pictures. I know men come home different or do not come home. I know this is going to be the hardest thing I have ever done, and I may not make it back. The next sentence was this: I am going anyway because someone has to. I want you to think about that. A 20-year-old who works in a bakery, who has read the testimony, who has no illusions about what he is walking toward, who is afraid because he is human and humans are always afraid, who writes the word anyway at the end of a sentence that begins with full knowledge of the worst. Anyway, That word. I have been a soldier for 41 years and I did not know what that word meant until I read Frank's diary. There is something else I am hesitating to tell you because it is the piece I am least certain I understand, and I have been uncertain about it for 2 years and I still have no framework that holds it properly, but it is important, and so will tell you. In the years after the wars, the humans built monuments, not to the victories, not to the brilliant strategy or the superior firepower or the commanders who made the right decisions. They built monuments to the soldiers who were lost, ordinary ones with ordinary names, in one city they call London. They built a structure with the words "the glorious dead." And then in the same city they built another structure that listed the names of those who were lost, not ranks, not recorded deeds, names, hundreds of thousands of names carved in stone so that the names would not disappear even when everyone who knew the people attached to those names was also gone. They built that because they needed it, not as political performance, not as propaganda. They built it because the idea of those people being forgotten was something they could not permit. The idea that Owen and George and Arthur and Frank and Wilfred had been in that mud and written those letters and made those jokes and given everything they had, and that their names might eventually vanish as if they had never existed, was a specific kind of harm that their civilization organized itself to prevent. A culture that goes to war and also writes the truth about war. A culture that produces soldiers and also produces the poets who say what those soldiers actually face. A culture that builds monuments to what it lost and makes its children learn the name so the loss is never abstract. I have served in 4 sectors and I have studied the war cultures of 31 species, and I have never encountered anything like it. The nearest comparison I can find is a creature that is injured and then, instead of ignoring the wound to preserve its ability to function, carefully documents the wound, measures its depth, sits with the pain of it, and passes the documentation to the next generation so that the wound is never forgotten. I do not know if that is a strength or not. I have been trying to determine this for 2 years. What I have is the 3rd story. In a year they counted as 1945. The humans built a weapon. I need to give you the technical information first because the technical information is what the council expects, and also because it provides the frame that makes everything else comprehensible. The weapon used nuclear fission to release energy at a scale that no conventional explosive had previously achieved. In practical terms, this means that a single device small enough to be carried in a single aircraft could destroy an entire city in under a second, not damage a city, not reduce military infrastructure to rubble, destroy the entire city, every structure, every person, every record of every person who had ever lived there. 2 such weapons were used in that year, in a conflict they called the Second World War against a nation in their Eastern Hemisphere. The first weapon destroyed a city called Hiroshima. The second destroyed a city called Nagasaki. The total number of people who lost their lives as a direct result of those 2 events is an order of magnitude I will spare you, because, as I said before, numbers at certain scales stop meaning anything and start just being large. The war ended shortly afterward. That is the military assessment of those 2 events. The weapon worked, the war ended in terms of military outcome. The logic is straightforward. But here is what is not contained in the military assessment. The scientists who built the weapon knew what they were building. They were not people who misunderstood the scale of what they were creating. They were the most precise and careful thinkers their civilization had produced in that generation, and they calculated exactly what the weapon would do, and they built it anyway. One of them, after the first successful test, looked at the detonation in the desert and quoted something from an old text about a god of destruction. He had built it anyway. I found his personal letters in the archive. He was afraid of what he had created. He wrote about it. He continued working in the field after the war because he believed the balance of power required it. He was afraid of what the balance of power required. He did both things simultaneously. He was afraid, and he continued afraid, and he continued. Now, what happened after the war ended is what I have been trying to find a framework for since I first encountered it. The humans had the weapon. They had proven it worked. They had the delivery systems and the strategic position. By every military logic I know, a civilization that has developed a decisive weapon and has the capacity to use it holds the advantage. An advantage is to be pressed, and pressing advantage is what wars are decided by. They did not press it. What they did instead was this: they watched as another major power developed the same weapon, and then instead of acting on the advantage while the window was open, they allowed that window to close. They permitted the other side to develop the same capacity. They watched in full awareness as the balance shifted from one-sided advantage to mutual capability, mutual destruction capability, meaning both sides now had enough of these weapons to end not just cities, but the entirety of human civilization on their planet, not most of it, all of it. Every person, every record of every person, every monument with every name, every letter Owen wrote about the sunset, all of it. Both sides had this capability, and for 80 years, neither side used it. I ran the probability models 11 times. I changed the input variables. I used different frameworks. I consulted the Legion Statistical Analysis Division. The numbers that came back were not numbers I knew how to report. They were in a range that corresponds to events that should not occur. They were in the range of mathematical impossibility. But it happened. For 80 years, two civilizations capable of ending each other stood with the weapons in their hands and did not use them. They built political systems around the mutual certainty of annihilation. They had negotiations. They had close calls, moments when the calculation came very close to resolving in the worst direction, moments I found in the declassified records of both sides that I read with the kind of focused attention I usually reserve for active combat situations. There were moments when a sensor error, or a miscommunication, or a single decision made by a single person in a single room could have ended everything. They got through those moments by will, by judgment, by the restraint of individuals whose names most of their own civilization does not know. In some cases, literally one person deciding not to act on information that indicated they were under attack, information that was later found to be a system error. One person, one decision, the entire planet continued. I have become fixated on a specific piece of military equipment. The humans have a nuclear launch authorization system, which in their cultural shorthand they refer to as the button. It is not literally a button in all cases, but the concept is the button. And I keep returning to it, I think. About the button the way I have thought. About Owen's letter and George's photograph and Frank's diary entry. It keeps pulling me back. I have found the testimony of people who held this responsibility, military officers and heads of state who carried the authority to initiate a nuclear exchange, people who in practical terms held the power to end their species with a single decision. I have read their personal testimony, their diaries, their private letters to people they trusted. Almost all of them were afraid. I need to say that again clearly because I want the council to understand exactly what I am telling you. The men and women who stood closest to the weapon that could end their species, who carried the authority to use it, who were responsible for making the decision, if the decision ever needed to be made, were afraid of the weapon, of the authority of their own hands near it. They had nightmares, multiple accounts describe waking in the night convinced they had already used it. Some of them described sitting in the dark afterward, checking, making sure. Some of them described returning to the responsibility in the morning with full knowledge of what it was, what it could do, what it meant to carry it. They carried it anyway. A man named Henry carried this responsibility for a period of years. In the middle of the 20th century, he was not originally a soldier. He came from a different field entirely before his service brought him to this place. I found his written account of the first time he fully understood what the authority in his possession meant. He wrote that he sat alone in a room afterward and was unable to move for a period of time. He was embarrassed to admit. He thought about his family. He thought about whether a person could be the right person for a responsibility this large, and whether the fact that he was asking the question meant he was not the right person, and whether the fact that the question had no answer was itself part of the design. He carried it anyway. A woman named Dorothy held a version of the same responsibility in a different capacity. She was an analyst. She was not at the level of authorization to use the weapon, but she was close enough to the decision that she understood it with precision. She wrote that the thing that frightened her most was not the weapon itself, it was the ordinary appearance of the environment in which the decision would be made, the ordinary rooms, the ordinary desks, the ordinary people in ordinary clothing who would make an irreversible decision about all life on their planet, and the decision would be made in a room that looked like any other room. I keep thinking, she wrote, that there should be something to mark the weight of it, something that tells you by looking that this is not an ordinary place, but there is nothing. It looks like a room where someone makes schedules. I understand that. I understand that more than I want to, because here is what the 80 years represents when I try to find its meaning in military terms. The 80 years is not just the absence of catastrophe. It is not just the fact that the weapon was not used. It is the sustained, daily, deliberate act of restraint performed by people who were afraid, who understood what they were carrying, who had access to information about how close the close calls were, who knew that the system they were maintaining was imperfect and fragile, and dependent on judgment as well as fortune, and they maintained it anyway. Afraid, every one of them, every day of. Those 80 years, afraid and holding. Steady anyway. A soldier once told me that true strength is not the absence of fear, it is the decision that something else matters more than the fear. I did not understand that when he said it. He was a human soldier I met during the first contact mission, talking about a personal situation I had asked about out of curiosity. I noted the phrase because I collect interesting phrases and did not know what to do with it yet. I know what to do with it now. The 80 years was that kind of strength. Every single day of it, performed by thousands of frightened people who understood exactly what they were holding and held it carefully anyway, because the alternative was something no one could permit. I set down my data slate. I look at the crack in the plinth. I have one more story. I want to tell you something I have never told anyone. I came back from the first contact mission and I presented my preliminary findings to my Legion command staff. I told them the standard information, threat level, military capability, recommended contact protocols. I told them the humans were adaptive and dangerous in close quarters and should be approached with standard defensive posture. I told them the relevant tactical data. I told them everything that was in the 7 reports I had written and deleted. I did not tell them about Owen's letter. I did not tell them about Arthur writing home about a chair by the fireplace. I did not tell them about George laughing in the mud. I did not tell them about Frank's diary entry and the word anyway. I did not tell them about Wilfred's poems or the monuments with the names or Dorothy sitting in the room that looked like a room where someone makes schedules. I did not tell them because I did not have a category. I am a soldier and I deal in categories and frameworks in classified threat assessments, and none of the things I had found fit any category I possessed. I told myself I was still processing. I told myself I would find the framework and file the full report once I had it. That was 2 years ago. That is why I am still here. That is why I am at this plinth with shaking hands and 7 deleted reports and a crack in the stone that I keep needing to look at. I want to tell you about the last human soldier I spoke to directly during the first contact mission. His name was Edward. He was 43 years old and had served in 2 active conflict zones before entering the diplomatic corps. His civilization assembled for the initial meetings with our survey team. He was not the highest-ranking person in that room. He was not the one who spoke the most, but I noticed him because he was the one who was most afraid, and his fear was visible in the specific way that human fear is visible when they are trained to conceal it but cannot quite man it completely. His hands were steady, his voice was steady, his eyes did not move to the exits. If you did not know what you were looking for, he looked composed, but he swallowed at precisely the moments when the conversation contained information that increased the threat assessment. I watched him do it 7 times in 3 hours, the throat moving, the brief closing of the eyes, the small gathering of breath that preceded every answer he gave to a question that mattered. He was terrified, and he sat in that room for 3 hours and answered every question with full presence and complete accuracy, and he did not flinch once. Afterward, I asked him through the translation interface we had established whether he found the meeting difficult. He looked at me for a moment, then he said, yes, everything about this is difficult. We have never done anything like this before. I did not sleep last night. I have not really slept properly in 3 weeks. I asked him why he was here then if he found it so difficult. He thought about that for longer than I expected. Someone had to be, he said. I am not the bravest person they could have sent. I am not even close to the bravest person they could have sent, but I know the material and I can hold myself together long enough to be useful, and that seemed like enough to qualify. I have thought about that answer for 4 years. It seemed like enough to qualify. Not bravery, not certainty, not the absence of fear, just I know the material I can hold together long enough. That seemed like enough. I have been a soldier for 41 years. I have never once thought about whether I was the bravest person available for a mission. The concept did not occur to me. I went because I was assigned, or because the calculation indicated it, or because the mission required someone with my capability, and I had the capability. Fear was not a variable because fear was not present. I went, that is all. I went the way a door opens when you push it. Edward went differently. Edward went knowing what it would cost him, knowing it would cost him sleep, and probably more than sleep, knowing he was not the best version of what the situation required, knowing he was going to be afraid in that room and would have to hold himself together through the afraid, and he calculated that he could do it, and he went. The door did not open for Edward. Edward pushed the door open from the inside of his fear while his hands wanted to shake. I have been trying to build a framework around this distinction for 2 years. I have not found one that holds, but I think the distinction matters. I think it might be the most important distinction I have ever encountered in 4 decades of military service, and I'm standing here in front of the Galactic Council with shaking hands because I cannot figure out how to put it in a report. Here is what I know. The Vreth are the best soldiers in the known galaxy by every objective metric. Speed, precision, sustained operational capacity, strategic adaptability, loss tolerance, post-conflict recovery, in every category that military assessment uses. We are at the top or very near it. We have maintained this position for 3,000 years. No species that has engaged us directly in sustained conflict has prevailed. That is not a boast. It is a measurement. We are the best soldiers in the known galaxy. And I am standing here 4 years after a 30-day first contact mission that took 19 months, having read Owen's letters and Frank's diary and Wilfred's poems and Dorothy's account of the room that looked like a room where someone makes schedules, having thought about George's laugh in Arthur's chair and Henry's silence and Edward's dry swallow at moments of elevated threat. And I am telling you something that I would not have believed if I had read it in another commander's report 4 years ago. I am afraid of the humans, not because they are more powerful than us. They are not currently. Their technology is significant and growing, but they are not at this moment our military superior in any direct comparison. Not because they are more numerous, they are not. Not because they are more strategically gifted, they are not by any measurement. I know. I'm afraid of them because of the word. Anyway, because of Frank sitting in the lamplight the night before he reported for duty, writing that he knew what was coming, and it was going to be the Hardest thing he had ever done, and he might not make it back. And then, writing, I am going anyway because someone has to. That word. That small, plain, enormous word. No Vreth has ever written anyway. The concept does not translate into our language because the concept has never needed to exist. We do not need a word for choosing to go towards something terrible in full knowledge of its cost, because we do not experience the cost. The way that requires a word, we go. The going does not cost us the thing it costs Edward. Every human soldier since the beginning of their warfare has been Edward. Every single one of them. Owen in the mud, Arthur writing about the chair, George laughing until it hurt in the fourth year, Frank with his bakery and his anyway, Wilfred writing the truth about the war while he was inside the war, Henry in the room afterward unable to move, Dorothy in the room that looked ordinary, Edward swallowing at the moments of elevated threat and answering every question with complete presence. Anyway, all of them afraid, everyone all the time, the fear was never not there. They went anyway. And this is the thing I cannot find a military framework for, because every framework I have is built on the assumption that a soldier who is afraid is a compromised soldier, a reduced soldier, a soldier operating below full capacity because the fear takes up space that capability should occupy. The humans do not work that way. I have read enough of their accounts to know that for many of them, the fear does not reduce their capacity, it sharpens it, it focuses them. The fact that the cost is real, that it is felt in the body, in the breath, in the throat, that it is present as a weight and not merely as a calculated variable, does something to the quality of their attention that I cannot replicate and cannot measure, but can observe in every record they left behind. Owen's letter about the sunset is not the writing of a man whose fear is reducing him. It is the writing of a man who is all the way present in his experience, because the experience is costing him something real, and the cost makes him see the colors more clearly than they would otherwise be visible. The sunset was more beautiful because Owen was afraid. George's laugh was harder because George was afraid. Frank's anyway is the most powerful in the archive because Frank was afraid. I do not know what to do with that. I have been a soldier for 41 years, and I do not know what to do with the fact that the thing I was designed to function without, the thing I was built to operate in the absence of, might be the source of something I have never had and never knew to want. Honored Council, my recommendation: do not go to war with the humans. I want to be specific about why, because the Council deserves specificity, and I have been holding back from it for over an hour, not because they will win in a direct military confrontation at current capability levels. They would sustain losses that would be catastrophic by any reasonable measure. We would not because they are morally untouchable. They have done terrible things in their history. The records are full of them. I will not use the Chamber's time enumerating them. They are a species that has caused significant harm to itself and to others, and the people who caused that harm mostly believe they were justified, as all people who cause significant harm mostly believe they are not beyond conflict or consequence. Here is why you should not go to war with them, because when you attack them, they will be afraid. They will be afraid before the first engagement. They will be afraid during the first engagement. They will sustain losses, and the losses will make them more afraid. They will have soldiers sitting in the dark the night before operations, writing letters home the way Owen and Arthur wrote, knowing what is coming, knowing what it costs, knowing they might not return. And they will get up in the morning, every morning for as long as it takes, afraid and up in the morning. You will not be able to calculate the end point of the war because the end point depends on the moment there. Soldiers stop believing that someone has to, and I have read 400 years of their military history, and I have not found that moment. I have found wars they lost. I have found engagements they withdrew from. I have found tactical retreats and strategic reversals and commanders who made the wrong call. I have not found the morning that Owen did not get up. I have not found the day that Frank stopped writing anyway. Honored Council, I set down my data slate at the beginning of this address. I told you I would not need it. I was right. The data did not contain what I needed to say. What I needed to say is this. I have spent 41 years as the kind of soldier I was built to be. I have never doubted my training, my capability, or my framework for understanding war. I have never filed a report I was uncertain of. I have never stood at this plinth and felt the ground shift under me. 4 years ago, I went to their world, expecting to find a civilization to classify. I found something I cannot classify. I found creatures who evolved afraid and have been afraid every single day since the beginning of their existence, and who have, despite that fear or because of it or in some complicated arrangement with it that I do not yet fully understand, built the most durable soldiers I have ever encountered. Not the most powerful, not the most precise, not the most technologically advanced, the most durable. Because durable is not about capability. In the moments when everything is going well, durable is about what happens in the 4th year of the mud when someone says something funny and you laugh until it hurts, and then you pick up your weapon in the morning. Durable is about Frank's anyway. It is about Arthur's chair. It is about Dorothy in the ordinary looking room doing the most important work there is while being completely, thoroughly humanly afraid. The crack in this plinth is very thin, very old. Someone made it without knowing it would be here when I needed it. I have been looking at it since I walked up to this plinth, and I want to tell you what I think it means, because I think it means something, even if I cannot file it in a report. I think it means that things built strong can still crack, that a crack does not always mean failure, that something can be cracked and load-bearing at the same time, and the crack is not the weakness. The crack is the evidence that the weight was real and the structure held. Owen held. Arthur held. Frank held. Edward held. All of them cracked one way or another. All of them afraid, all of them costly. All of them going anyway because someone had to. I am Scathel, commander of the 9th Carapace Legion. I have never been afraid of anything. I have stood in the fire of 43 worlds, and I have not once felt the thing that Edward felt in that room, the thing that George felt every morning of that 4th year, the thing that Frank felt with his pen in his hand, and the word anyway waiting to be written. I am going to walk out of this chamber and file a recommendation of peaceful contact and cautious alliance with the species designated human. And then I am going to go back to my quarters, and I am going to think about the joke. The one that made George laugh until his eyes closed, until his head went back, until someone put a hand on his shoulder. In the mud in the 4th year of the war. I have been thinking about it for 3 years. I have been reading everything George left behind, everything his friends left behind, looking for the specific joke. I have not found it, but I think I know what it was about. I think it was about something ordinary, something small, something from home. Maybe a memory of a chair by a fire, or a sunset that looked like the world was catching fire from the inside out, or a mother who needed something good to hold in an envelope, something that cost almost nothing to say and meant everything to hear. I think George's friend looked at the mud and the cold in the 4th year of all of it, and he found the smallest, most human thing he could find, and he said it out loud. And George laughed, and the world kept going. That is my recommendation. That is all I have.